Comencem, doncs, una nova taula rodona d'aquest seminari que organitza el Fòrum Liberal Europeu i la Fundació Catalans. Jo hi represento la Fundació Nous Catalans, és una de les fundacions que també dona suport a aquest seminari i se m'ha demanat de moderar aquesta taula rodona sobre l'impacte de la migració sobre el populisme en 3 casos concrets. Holanda o els Països Baixos, aquí posa Espanya però serà bàsicament Catalunya, pel que m'ha comentat el ponent que em farà l'informe, l'experiència, i Alemanya. En primer lloc, doncs, agrair que se m'hagi convidat i que s'hagi convidat a la Fundació Nous Catalans a formar part d'aquest important, interessant segur, seminari d'anàlisi de l'impacte dels populismes o dels nacionalismes populistes a l'Europa d'avui. Aquest dematí, a veure, és cert que ara analitzarem bàsicament 3 països, el cas d'Alemanya, el cas d'Holanda i el cas de Catalunya, tots ells molt diferents, però al dematí, tant en la intervenció que ha fet la doctora Gimbernau, com que hem parlat més de marc, d'introducció, com després en la primera taula rodona, que hem conegut 3 impactes importants. Grècia, on doncs, i un dels fenòmens que preocupen aquí, en tot cas, a mi personalment vull dir que em preocupa molt el que està passant en aquests moments a Grècia. Em preocupa també a Finlàndia, però és diferent del que he vist. I em preocupa també el que pot passar en altres països de centre Europa, el cas d'Hongria, on hi ha una majoria important, com s'ha vist, una força política molt majoritària que introdueix o ha estat empeltada d'un discurs d'un nacionalisme populista perillós, molt perillós en el cas extrem de Grècia, perillós també en el cas concret de Finlàndia, perillós també en altres estats europeus. Per desgràcia, el fenomen d'aquest nacionalisme populista o nacionalisme racista o nacionalisme excloent és avui de pujada emergent en molts estats europeus. Crec que no és el cas de Catalunya. Jo esperaré amb molta atenció a sentir el testimoni d'un investigador català, però que s'ho mira des d'Oxford. I en tot cas sí que volia en aquesta introducció volia permetre una mica explicar per què veig que és molt diferent. A veure, l'impacte. La professora Gimbernau deia que hi ha 2 grans impactes que han fet emergir amb força en aquests darrers anys el populisme o el nacionalisme populista a Europa. Per una banda, la greu crisi econòmica que vivim en el nostre continent, però sobretot també l'impacte de les fortes migracions que hi ha hagut en aquests darrers anys, en aquestes darreres dècades. En el cas d'Alemanya estem parlant de dècades, o de França. En el cas de l'Europa del Sud estem parlant de menys temps. Dir-vos que a Catalunya en els últims 12 anys han arribat 1,5 milions de ciutadans nous. Catalunya era un país de 6 milions i poc més, ara fa 12 anys enrere, i avui som un país de 7,5 milions. I no ha estat pas per creixement demogràfic normal, sinó que ha estat per una onada migratòria de més d'1,5 milions de persones que han vingut a Catalunya d'arreu del món. Avui a Catalunya es parlen més de 230 llengües. Avui a Catalunya hi viu gent, o ha arribat gent, de prop de 180 països d'arreu del món. I, malgrat això, diguem-ne, aquest país no coneix, això després tindrem xifres per valorar-ho, però no coneix, si voleu, l'emergència greu d'un nacionalisme excloent o racista o xenòfob o populista, com hem vist en alguns casos i en veurem ara en altres casos dintre d'Europa. Jo tenia només un element més que volia introduir en aquesta taula rodona, és a dir, Catalunya en aquests moments com a país està en un procés cap a poder tenir estructures d'estat propi i això es porta des d'un nacionalisme, o això s'impulsa des d'un nacionalisme cosmopolita, com deia aquest dematí la professora, no? Però en tot cas vull dir que podia haver caigut cap a la banda fosca, si es vol, del populisme i no hi ha caigut. A part de petits casos concrets, però no hi ha caigut el nacionalisme, diguem-ne, democràtic, el nacionalisme liberal, el nacionalisme cosmopolita de la Catalunya moderna és obert, és integrador. Hi ha dos elements que configuren el model central d'aquest poble. D'una banda, Catalunya és un sol poble, i això no ho diem avui, això ja fa dècades que forma part del llegat, diguem-ne, estratègic del país. Hem arribat a un marc de referència que és un pacte nacional per la immigració subscrit per la immensa majoria de forces polítiques i socials i sindicals del país, des de l'esquerra fins a les forces de centre i de centre-dreta del país, i una mica és allò una base que podrien definir l'antic president de Catalunya, el senyor Jordi Pujol, havia definit ben bé qui era català, i amb això és la filosofia de fons que una mica indica que no hi ha un nacionalisme excloent a casa nostra, ans al contrari, és català tota aquella persona que viu, que treballa i qui se sent de Catalunya. I aquest és el marc filosòfic que jo crec que permet, doncs bé, en aquest cas una visió molt oberta, una visió molt clara, sempre a partir dels drets i dels deures de tots els ciutadans. La Fundació Nous Catalans, que és coorganitzadora d'aquest seminari, que jo dirigeixo, doncs justament és la institució a prop del govern de Catalunya i a prop de la formació política majoritària Convergència i Unió, que juntament també amb els treballs que s'estan fent des de la Fundació Catem de fa temps, de sempre, que treballem en sintonia en aquesta direcció, com a think tank, si voleu, com a espai de laboratori d'experiències i de sinergies associatives per tirar endavant tot aquest procés. I ja res més, passo a presentar els membres d'aquesta taula rodona, d'aquest panel. En primer lloc, el senyor Volker Görzel, que té una llarga trajectòria al si, trajectòria política, entenc, al si del Partit Liberal d'Alemanya. Havia estat membre, ja fa uns anys, de les joventuts, o va començar a les joventuts liberals. Avui és assessor i membre del Consell a Colònia, a Colom, a Alemanya, encarregat de la legislació i administració, i recentment, enguany, ha estat nomenat candidat a les eleccions del setembre de l'any que ve, candidat a diputat al Bundestag. Per tant, bé, comencem per ell, amb l'experiència, l'aportació que ens farà des del cas alemany. Després ja presentaré els altres dos ponents d'aquesta mesa. Senyor Görzel, té vostè la paraula.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this very friendly introduction. As mentioned, I'm Volker Görzel. I'm from Cologne in Germany. Cologne is, with something above 1 million inhabitants, the biggest city in Germany, which is not at the same time a capital, a federal capital or a regional capital. So my city, in which I represent my party, is quite of a melting pot of all the immigration issues we've heard earlier this morning. And I'm very pleased to be here and have the chance to talk to you about immigration and its impact on nationalism in Germany. Well, I'm also very pleased to be here at the ELF, European Liberal Forum, because ELF is the nickname of the German football team. ELF means 11. Those of you who don't know about football, 11 players. So, and talking about football is the reason why there is something like patriotism in Germany. We heard earlier this morning a very vast survey of definitions in this context, and nationalism, or the German translation of the word nationalism, is a taboo word, as you can imagine, for historic reasons mainly. And only if it comes to football, every 2 years when our team plays at the World or at the Euro team Cup, there's something like a nationalism or patriotism. You can see people who lift flags in their garden at the windows, and you feel something like pride or proud to be German. But that's an exception. 99.9% of the time, Germans really don't have a good feeling, in the public opinion and at least, about their nation. And this is one of the reasons why we have problems with the term nationalism. Anyway, it was mentioned earlier that there are certain specifications about Germany, and I would do the following with you. I would very much like to talk to you about the migration situation in Cologne, in my hometown, and in Germany as a general. Then I would like to talk about the political right in Germany. And I would like at last to pick up some issues that were mentioned earlier before lunch breaks about the situation in my country, especially about the ban of political parties from the far right. Well, Germany, as I said earlier, 1 million people, about 150,000 of them have a migration background. Most of them have a background and are now in the second or third generation of immigrants who came after World War II, when Germany was an emerging economic power. Most of them stayed, got children, and are now living a peaceful, nice life. But after the fell down of the Iron Curtain, since 1990, we had a major influx of Germans, native Germans, or ethnic Germans better said, from Eastern Europe, who came to Germany. And this group is one of the biggest immigration groups or immigrant groups we have in Germany right now. There are German by passport, but they don't really have German roots. This is for historic reasons. And telling you, this group is one of these, especially in Cologne, one of the groups we have the most problems with in areas, as mentioned earlier, education, dropout rate in school, welfare recipients, all that what we mentioned earlier. In Cologne, it is about 50 to 60,000 people who have a background from Eastern Europe coming to Cologne. And there's one aspect which is very interesting. You have hate between the traditional foreigners in Germany and in Cologne especially, and hate against those who are from Eastern Europe. There are fights between both groups and with each other. And this is, from my point of view, one of the most sources of criminal offenses between the two groups between each other. So we have a problem there, which is on the top agenda of the local polices, at least where I'm living at, and I know it also from all other bigger German cities like Berlin. In Munich, the situation is somewhat different. For 2 months, we have now a new situation in Germany as a whole and in Cologne specifically. We have an increasing number of asylum seekers and refugees, and not as you might think, they are not from Northern Africa and they are not from Syria, they are from the former Yugoslavia. All our housing projects, all our asylum housing in Cologne are totally overcrowded. Hotels need to be rented in order to keep refugees there, to provide housing there. We have had about 900 to 1,000 people arriving in Cologne since, I think, end of August. 90% of them do have a background of former Yugoslavia. Most of them are Roma. There is an official version why they are coming, and there's an unofficial version why they are coming. The official political correct version is that they are coming for reasons the colleague from Hungary mentioned earlier, discrimination and mobbing in their home countries. But if you look closer at it, there could be a connection between the fact that in Germany, the welfare rate, the spending each asylum seeker receives per month and per person was just raised from 220 euro per month and person up to, I think, 320 or something like that. And with this, when this came out in early August, the tremendous influx started. We know by comparison from Belgium that in Belgium the number of asylum seekers from former Yugoslavia are not increasing. So there might be a correlation. This is a new situation, and this issue has put the asylum seeker issue on the political agenda again. It had been off the agenda for years, but now it's rising again. Also, I would like to mention that in Cologne and in Germany in general, there is a certain environment. There are groups, there are NGOs, there are supporters, there are organizations that help asylum seekers to come and to find housing, to find places. And this is not only by charity reason or reason for religious belief, but this is also for very political reasons. You can almost say that the entire organization landscape in this area is very left. The very left in Germany has a tremendous interest that the number of immigrants from the countries I mentioned earlier rises. Why I'm telling you that? Because I am member not only of the City Council of Cologne, but of a committee in which we discuss every month the exact number of asylum seekers, the exact places of asylum seekers, where they are located at, what we are doing with them. This is my daily business. I do it, not daily, but once a week. I get papers and I have to go through it and I have to debate with the police, with neighbors, with whoever is involved in order to find housing, find jobs for those who come to my city. So this is a very practical point of view. In Cologne, we have a group which is called Pro-Cologne, Pro-Köln, and is a far-right group. It's a political party. So far it has been successful only in Cologne, in my city. There have been attempts to run at elections on the regional level and on the national level, but these attempts failed. We talked about that earlier. But in Cologne, this group is very active, and they have received about 7 to 10% of the electoral vote in the past election. Why is that? In Cologne, we are in the process of building the biggest Islamic church, mosque, in Germany. It is a wonderful building. Whenever you come to Cologne, go, drive there, get a cab, and look at it. It's wonderful. But this Islamic church is located in an area where there is a starting resentment against foreigners, against Muslims, and Pro-Köln, the far-right party, picked up this atmosphere and flourished on this atmosphere. This is their stronghold, and this is their only issue. They are a namely anti-Islamic party. They organize international anti-Islamic conventions in Cologne, and whenever there is such a convention, it's like civil war. There's police everywhere. There are about 50 to 100,000 people who demonstrate against them, and there are about 500 to 1,000 people who support them. So this is a very, very unusual feeling for us in Cologne, who we always think we are very tolerant and rather drink beer than discussing these issues. So we have the direct relation between migration, religious issues, and a strengthening of the political far right. How do we handle this? I was listening very carefully earlier this morning when there was a little debate here about how to deal with the far right in parliaments or in the public debate, political debate. To say it up front, there is no continuing strategy of the democratic factions in Cologne. Mainly, we are ignoring them. We are ignoring them wherever they appear. But they make it very easy for us to ignore them because their behavior is very rude. Whenever there's a parliamentary session, they are yelling, they are shouting, they are until they get kicked out. So it's very easy for us to ignore them just because of their manners and their behavior. But every once in a while, we cannot only ignore them. And the democratic parties in my city, we are now discussing a shift in our strategy. The shift means whenever they have an application or a resolution in our local parliament, it used to be that we did not discuss their bills. So whenever they came with their red-wing crap, we remained silent and voted against it. We didn't give them the floor to spread their words. So we used the rules in order to ignore them, in order to keep them small. But now, every once in a while, whenever they bring in a resolution into the local parliament, which cannot be ignored because it's so far right, the democratic parties coordinate who talks against that. And mainly it's one of the majority leaders, or it's even the mayor who then, which is very seldom in German municipal things, that the mayor really gives a speech in the local council. And whenever the far right now applies for some real right-wing issue, we talk against that. Also, one third strategy. When I left Cologne yesterday, there were police actions and police searches at all houses and all offices of members of this party who are also members of the council or other officers of that party. Not for political reasons, of course. We do not have a political police in Germany. But for for different reason, because these guys cheat by claiming more compensation for party meetings and other meetings in which you are normally obliged to claim compensations, as it is okay. So what are they doing? They are doing a meeting every day and claim for each meeting per person 20 euro. But these meetings never happen. And this now came out, so they are cheating on the administration, on the government, if you want to put it like this way. So we have a new tool in order to keep them small, the criminal law book. So this is one other strategy, if it comes to terms, which you can use. Last but not least, I would like to do some remarks and comments on issues that were raised earlier. We do have a very, very intense discussion right now in Germany about the ban of a political party, about the National German Party. It is not very easy to ban a party. I think you brought it up earlier this morning. There are very, very high hurdles in order to ban a party. The highest German court, the Court on the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany, is the only body that can ban a party. So it is not the majority in parliament or the police or whoever who can ban a party. And you need to meet very high requirements in order to ban a party. This party must be very offensive against the democratic order of the Federal Republic of Germany. And this is very hard to prove. And for this reason, a party ban in Germany requires a very good and clear preparation. It will take several months, which gives the party time to show itself. And there is an inherent risk that the highest German court will not ban that party. And this is the decisive risk, because when the highest court doesn't ban this party, they feel very legitimate. So it's also a political issue if this party ban is brought into effect. Also, I would like to talk to you about one thing that shatters Germany with respect to far right-wing activities. It came out that there was a real terror group in Germany, a right-wing terror group. We have terror groups, or we've had terror groups in many European countries. In Germany, we had terror groups, political terror groups in the 70s. And since the early 80s, mid-80s, it was rather quiet in Germany. And now it came out just 1 year ago that there was a far right-wing so-called National Socialist underground. And they committed at least I think 9 or 10 murders within a couple of years. And this really shattered the nation, and there is also a political implication in that issue, because there might be an involvement of, I'm very careful with what I'm saying, there might be an involvement with German authorities and this group. For instance, we have a special committee in national and in local parliaments that investigate on this issue, and it just came out last week that after some of the group members were arrested last year, afterwards files and documents were destroyed, knowingly that they might be used for investigations. So it's like in a criminal a crime story a little bit. And this is an issue which also is very much on the political agenda right now. One last point, which leads me back to where I started, namely the impact of immigrants and religious beliefs that play a role in that issue. We do have a rising problem with the so-called Salafists. This is a group within the Muslim world, and they have now stepped into a new quality of crime. We've just had a couple of months ago in Bonn, which is the former federal German capital, a demonstration. And during that demonstration, Salafists tried to stab policemen, and of course counter-demonstrators. And this is a new quality. I think on Monday there was a court decision at the local court in Bonn, which is in charge. The murderer, or the attempted murderer, was convicted to 6 years prison. And the policeman said during this trial, it was the first time that I really feared someone wants to kill me. And these Salafists, they said in front of court, I do not have to obey to any power and any authority here on earth. I only have authority and obey to authority from sky, or from heaven. This is a new quality. We do have a rising number of these Salafists who provenly attack more violent than anything we've seen so far in that area. And this, of course, this is the point, and this, of course, triggers counter-reaction on the far right. The local group in Cologne, Pro Köln, organized Mohammed picture showings, especially to provoke the Salafists. And there you can see that there is a very, very heated atmosphere in which we all need to be responsible to cool it down. In Cologne, in my home city, in Berlin, and all over Germany, this is the situation, and I thank you very much for your attention.
I ara li passo la paraula al següent ponent, és el senyor Marc van Ostaijen. Ell és doctorant al Departament d'Administració Pública de la Universitat a Rotterdam, a Holanda. Té experiència, és expert en temes o en recerca sobre immigració i populisme, i té, pel que veig en el seu currículum, té un ampli historial de publicacions en l'àmbit de les migracions, en l'àmbit del populisme o del nacionalisme populista. Per tant, li dono la paraula i és l'aportació que ens farà, en aquest cas, des del que està passant a Holanda, als Països Baixos.
We are not interested anymore in our heritage and our ancestors. We don't know anything about our history and common identity, and we are unaware of our achievements, to which democracy is one of them. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Let's put up some fire on the discussion. This statement is from Pim Fortuyn, one of the most important Dutch populist politicians of the last decades, assassinated in 2002. As populist politician, he politicizes democracy as something of us and of our identity. For me, this sentence questions: where does democracy end and where does populism start? This sentence shows the tense issue connection of populism with democracy, since the biggest challenge of populism seems its origin, democracy. I will come back later on this issue. I'm asked by the Hans van Milo Stichting to enjoy this panel, and I'm very grateful to do that on ELF as well. But I am an autonomous researcher, and I'm not from a political party, so I will speak as a academician. And therefore, I need to take some steps back, actually, from the discussion. I will elaborate on this tense and fragile relationship, which I spoke yet, between populism and democracy in 2 steps. First, I will empirically zoom in on populism and its relation to migration, like the title of the panel, so I will obey that. And secondly, to be able to reconfigure what consequences this has for our theoretical understanding of populism and democracy. So I will first empirically zoom in on populism and its relation with migration by delivering you some highlights of our study on populism in migration policies. I consider populism as a distancing discourse, in a sense that it relates 2 concepts: a heartland of a certain in-group in opposition of an out-group of a certain other. And this can be a horizontal other, like the immigrant or the migrant, or a vertical other, which can be the elite. By relating these antagonisms, proximity of a heartland and the distancing of an other can take place. And therefore I conceptualize populism as a discursive distancing strategy of antagonistic relationships. This distancing discourse can therefore occur in every social playing field and is not allocated for politics only. And therefore, populism is not reserved for populists only. Populist discourse can be played out in politics, it can be played out in policy and administration, in mass media, in arts, maybe even in sciences. In one study, we studied populism in public policies as most likely case. To be specific, within immigrant integration policies, since populism as political manifestation seems to have a niche on this issue. We studied this distancing discourse within the period of 2002 until 2010 in the cities of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. And this study brings 2 major issues to the front. First of all, policy populism, which we found, is present in local policies without the need of political populism, known as a manifest political populist party. But when political populism is in charge, policy populism becomes more manifest. Maybe you're getting puzzled by my whole exposition. To exemplify this aspect of policy populism, this is a sentence behind me of Rotterdam integration policy in 2002. This is integration policy in Rotterdam. The situation arose where newcomers do still not feel welcome in the city. Old newcomers are still not integrated. And Rotterdam citizens do not feel at home anymore in their city. Ladies and gentlemen, this is policy populism. This shows a very manifest distancing discourse of an in-group people, the Rotterdam citizen, opposing an out-group, new and old newcomers, which means migrants, problematized towards each other. This is how populism as a distancing discourse works and comes forward and can legitimize certain governmental interventions. The second issue that our study showed is that the presence of populism as a distancing discourse changed the usage of in-group and out-group categories and changed migration policy as a topic. The usage of in-group and out-group people or categories changed in such a way that the in-group, the people, became inclusive civic. By that I mean categories like everybody, all Amsterdam citizens, all Rotterdam citizens, the average Rotterdam citizen, and stuff like that. And the others became exclusive ethnic, like criminal Moroccans, criminal Antillians, whatsoever. This development sharpened the demarcation line, who is in and who is out, of society on the basis of ethnicity. The uses of migration as policy topic also changed. In our study, we showed that the migration problem actually has become a safety problem. And this connects with literature on the securitization of migration. And this shift can be exemplified by this sentence, also from Rotterdam Policy in 2003. Social integration delivers an important contribution to the social cohesion, which is a premise for informal social control and for subjective and objective safety. Working on safety and social integration needs to go hand in hand. I think this is a beautiful illustration of the hegemonic practice of safety as an overall strategy to discipline certain deviancies, mostly certain ethnicities, making migration, first of all, a safety issue. This can be an effect of populist emergence. However, as a articulatory practice, we found that there is no need for political populism to influence the existence of policy populism, like I just said. Policy populism can exist even when there is no political populist party in charge. This shows the shift of populist significance from only a political towards a broad social phenomenon. For instance, in another study, we showed that the mechanisms by which populism operates are also very present in mass media. Therefore, since populism has this major emergence within society in which politics is just a manifest case, its significance cannot be underestimated. But at the same time, a lot of liberals and Democrats can feel inconvenient about this emergent reality. Do we just need to accept this new emergent reality, or are there ways to resist? Thus, I question, for my second part, to what extent are democracy and populism conflicting each other? And from a democratic point of view, in what way do we need to understand or justify the emergence of populism? This aspect considers the second part of my contribution. So, how do we need to understand or justify the emergence of populism as a social phenomenon? For answering this question, I need to start with an example. This is an artwork of Maurizio Cattelan, and however its family name suggests different, he's an Italian artist. Unfortunately. This artwork is installed in the Dutch museum Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, and is, in my opinion, a striking artistic portrait of populism as a social phenomenon. Next to the conceptualization of populism and distancing discourse, to study it as a social or sociological development, populism can be seen as rebelling, provoking the status quo. I think our German colleague just showed how that works in political practice, or breaking with the establishment. This is what Cattelan portrays. A man breaking through the ground floor and taking position within the established 17th century Dutch masters. An artwork of a normal man contrasted with paintings of famous Dutch masters as the artistic elite, and is not only a normal man. This sculpture is the casting of Cattelan himself. He visualized a personalized break with the establishment. Therefore, it is the literal breakthrough of the normal man claiming a position in the established order of the museum. For me, this artistic creation is a very clever symbolic illustration of populism as a social mechanism. Why do I show this artistic creation of Maurizio Cattelan? Well, some consider populism, we also saw that in the early morning, as a syndrome, a virus, a modern problem, as anti-democratic, anti-parliamentary, or maybe something else. With Cattelan, I show a different mechanism, which in politics makes that populism reminds democracy of itself. Political populism is a direct appeal to the real people. In that sense, it claims to be the authentic, pure, and romantic version of democracy, a technique of government by and on the basis of the people. And by centralizing the people as such, it reminds democracy of its own core constitution. And therefore, in my view, it cannot be anti-democratic or, let's say, a problem. There's only one main difference which needs consideration. Populism tends to appeal to the people. The people, as a heartland, as an in-group, is an important rhetoric construction pretending that one appeals to the people as a majority. And here comes the difference. Since democracy is constituted as collection of minorities, and on this specific part, populism and democracy conflict. Political populism does appeal to the real people or the normal citizen. It pretends to represent a large popular movement, like the case of Hungary showed very well. Therefore, it's not a representation of the people. It tends to be a presentation of the people. And this aspect is what liberals and Democrats fear the most as the totalitarian temptation of populist emergence. Also in Belgium, liberals and Democrats feared the populist rise of Vlaams Blok, Flemish Bloc, later called Vlaams Belang, Flemish interest. In the beginning, the Flemish interest had a huge electional victory for the Flemish as well as for the Belgian parliament. But all parties in Belgium put up a cordon sanitaire. The overall agreement that every political party will exclude the cooperation with Flemish interest. What was the effect? Flemish interest diminished in every election with a rock bottom at the latest municipality elections, 10% in Antwerp, which was their main seat. Wow, some politicians and political scientists, they yell out, hooray, and see that this is the best example to ban a political party which you do not like. Put up a cordon sanitaire. It stimulates the steady fall of populist parties. But the Belgian case shows a truly different reality. At the same time of the cordon sanitaire, a new political party was established, the N-VA, the New Flemish Alliance, now led by frontman Bart de Wever. This N-VA positioned itself actually as the acceptable variant of Flemish interest, with no racist or extreme right insinuations or associations, but instead being a nationalist, separatist and populist political party. And while Flemish interest diminished, the N-VA raised and raised and raised, and even in bigger amounts. The N-VA now even has a stronger populist voice than ever before. Recently that large that Bart de Wever can become the mayor of Antwerp on this moment. Ironically, this cordon sanitaire made populism in Flanders stronger than ever before. By marginalizing populism, it expanded. In the Netherlands, my home country, liberals and democrats also feared the emergence of Geert Wilders' Freedom Party. With his provocative political style and rebelling agenda, he presented unconventional politics. For instance, he wanted to restrict further immigration, restrict further European integration, and stop subsidies for the cultural elites. In the former national election of 2010, his party was with 23 seats of 150, the third largest party in the Netherlands. The negotiations constructed a minority government in which the liberals and Christian Democrats gave him a tolerance position. We call that gedogen. In this minority government. And this meant that he supported the government on his policy issues like migration, foreign policy or culture. But he could distance himself from policy in which he was not in favor. For these latter issues, this minority government needed to gain support at other parties of parliament. In this Dutch case, the manifest political populist party was accommodated. They gave him indirect governmental power. But on issues of government as such, he was directly responsible. Therefore, when he stepped out and quitted the last negotiations on large governmental cuts, he was blamed for his immoral performance, taking no responsibilities for the country as such. Accommodating new or populist parties directly in the seat of power is a well-known Dutch strategy of pacification. If you can't beat them, join them. By connecting the provocative strains of this populist party within Dutch consensus democracy, populism becomes toothless. The last national elections of some months ago, Geert Wilders' PVV diminished to 15 seats, now convicted to the opposition. In other words, what do both cases learn us? And I will round up. Between accommodation and aversion, as democratic answer, the Dutch case shows that populism, but whatever kind of new political movement, can at best be accommodated. That means within the rule of law and by democratic conflict. The emergence of populism shows a need of conflict, a need to re-politicize politics. In that sense, populism reminds democracy of itself, and therefore populism reminds all other politicians to re-politicize certain issues again. By democratic conflict, liberals and Democrats can distance themselves on populist issues by further politicizing it. It opens the opportunity to take a stance on those issues of which the so-called establishment thought that they were already solved or finished. Like how Catalan reminds the museum visitor of the normal people in the face of old masters. Catalan's art sculpture enables to revalue the old Dutch masters from a provocative perspective, confronting sculpture but an artistic contribution, like populism, confronting politics but a democratic contribution. The Belgian aversion case of the cordon sanitaire shows that democracy can threaten itself if it does not fully accept its own constitution of minorities. By a cordon sanitaire, a certain majority within democracy pass a certain minority by neglecting it as such. This illustrates that democracy has the largest incapability to handle with minorities in times of populist politics. At this point, democracy can become a totalitarian value, even at the point that some minorities can be excluded. Democracy is built upon the thesis, we agree to disagree. Exclusion cannot be legitimate on the basis of content, on size, of persons, and therefore I do not agree with the tactics of my German colleague. In this way, we can reverse the argument that populism is a threat for democracy in the argument that democracy can be a threat for populism, since democracy has the largest incapability to cope with minorities in times of populist politics. See the cordon sanitaire. In this way, democracy can be a threat for itself. The Belgian and Dutch case show Lacanianly that you can only understand yourself in the face of the other. Populism faces democracy with its own mirror. Liberals and Democrats can only face populism by not denying its mirror image. I wish you good luck. Thank you.
Ja per cloure aquesta taula i després de l'última intervenció farem una estona de debat. Havíem d'acabar a 2:15, però potser allargarem fins a una mica més, perquè també hem començat una mica més tard. Jo li dono la paraula ara al Sergi Pardos. Ell és un català, però és investigador a Oxford, a la Universitat d'Oxford, i ens parlarà de Catalunya. A partir de dades del cas català, és especialista en temes de migracions i de comportament electoral. I penso que pot ser justament molt interessant. Remarco que a la sala, a part de la gent que segueix des del dematí aquest seminari, aquesta tarda han vingut més dirigents associatius del món de les entitats de la migració aquí a Catalunya, que segueixen, per tant, segur que seguiran amb interès tot, però molt, l'anàlisi que farà el Sergi de com ho veu ell, un català, però des de lluny, o tampoc, però Oxford no està ben bé aquí al costat. Per tant, és la paraula.
Moltes gràcies, no pressure. Thanks very much to the CADDEM Foundation and to Professor Colominas for counting on me for this presentation. It is always a pleasure when someone calls you to talk about a topic that you're interested in, but when this happens at home, this is just fascinating. So thanks very much for this. I have a bit of an issue with being the last one to talk, but that's okay. In the next 20 minutes then, I will try to talk about the Catalan case, and more specifically, if you wish, the question that will probably articulate my presentation is whether nationalist attitudes are linked to populist radical right voting here in this context. And I hope that it's also an underlying question, basically in a round table with this topic, and for people not of course, that familiar with the Catalan political space. First of all, I will have to just put in context the role of nationalism and social identity in the literature and theories of radical right voting. And second, I will just show some empirical applications to the Catalan case to see to which extent and which type of nationalism is truly linked to populist anti-immigrant behavior here. Let me just start by talking about the very first out of the two main competing theoretical paradigms to try to understand anti-immigrant behavior that is called group conflict theory. According to this theory, individuals are rational actors that compete for resources like salaries, jobs, welfare, housing, etc. So in this case, according to this theory, natives are not racist in nature, but intergroup hostility, as we all know, increases just when competition increases. From a very applied and practical perspective in terms of, applied and empirical political science, the main expectation to try to understand the types of individuals that will, express radical anti-immigrant behavior is looking at low levels of skill, income, educational strata, always under the assumption that immigrants come and play at the lower bound of the labor market continuum. And therefore, these are the profile of people that are more likely to nourish populist movements. Let me move on to the second main theoretical argument, which is where nationalism plays a role in explaining anti-immigrant radical behavior, which is social identity theory. In this case, individuals are not rational, they are not necessarily instrumental. This is a rather static theory expecting identity to emerge as a cognitive and durable process, us versus the others. And there are many mechanisms that can explain this, and the authors agree or disagree with many others: socialization, value heritage, even biological explanations in terms of preservation of the own reference group. We can agree or disagree with these mechanisms, but the main expectation in this case, again, from a voting behavior point of view, is that the stronger the attachment towards the in-group, the stronger the hostility is going to be towards the out-group. What is attachment towards the in-group here is when, at least applying to the Catalan case, the terminology coming from comparative European research travels badly. So the word to define attachment towards the in-group is usually nationalism, which is a word very differently used in this context by academics, public opinion and political practitioners. Some authors disagree with nationalism and they use patriotism, chauvinism. So the point here is that the terminology is a little bit complex and sometimes, if you wish, a little bit imprecise. Both group conflict and social identity allow us not only to predict individual behavior, but also a kind of systemic behavior. They try to also shed light on when and why radical right actors are more likely to be successful and to emerge. So let's assume this theoretical framework in which we see a hypothetical post-industrial Western democracy the political space is structured in two axes. The first one is the classical economic left-right dimension. So you see a horizontal thick line distinguishing economic pro-redistribution positions versus pro-market rightist economic positions. And you see a new vertical axis of competition, which is also what we talk about, which is the axis that social identity theories talk about, which distinguishes liberal or cosmopolitan, in this case, from authoritarian conservative opinions, gay rights, euthanasia, also immigration. And the word nationalism is in this literature usually placed at the bottom of this vertical line. So the theory, or both theories, stress a different axis of competition, but the process is that the lower left quadrant that you see in this graph, working class or low middle class, traditionally represented by social democratic mainstream parties or even by post-Marxist, more radical left-wing parties, this socio-demographic component shrinks and the upper left quadrant grows in size. When this happens, classical mainstream social democratic parties face a bit of a dilemma, which consists of staying where they are, representing the old left-wing spaces, or, what has happened in many European democracies, converge economically with the mainstream right, a bit competing more with the centrist or central voter, and also starting to compete on new issues like euthanasia, like gay rights, like immigration, to try to avoid losing votes towards the upper quadrant, to try to avoid losing votes towards the new left. When this happens, the stronger this process, the stronger this swing, the lower left quadrant, the traditional working class, lower middle class, becomes orphaned from a political option, and therefore this is when radical right parties have a stronger political opportunity structure to emerge and to be successful. And this is basically by scoring very low in the authoritarian axis and theoretically being nationalist according to this literature, and being a bit ambiguous in the economic axis. Some authors say that they are more towards the left or towards the right, but for sure they definitely, through a populist and clientelistic discourse, they fulfill this need of redistribution, this need of economic protection that these classes have. In any case, from an individual or from a systemic perspective, these two ways to understand radical right voting come up with two hypotheses, with two expectations that I'm going to try to validate and show in the Catalan case in order to be systematic and understand where anti-immigrant behavior is coming from. According to group conflict theory, radical right votes should come from transfers from classical left-wing spaces or classical relatively low socioeconomic and educational profiles, according to the very first theory. And the second theory, the second hypothesis, the one that is actually concerning us more today, is that the emergence of radical right parties is mainly due to the transfer from national electoral spaces. So we are going to see which of these two expectations is going to be more valid in the Catalan case, and therefore we're going to see to which extent the concept of nationalism that we have in mind fits with what we thought. Catalonia is, I think, a very good case study to see whether these hypotheses work or not, because what we call nationalism belongs to this identity center-periphery cleavage that is completely independent from the axis that you saw in the previous slide. So here we have pro-Catalan political parties that are left-wing and that are right-wing, and we have pro-Spanish identity parties which are left-wing and right-wing. So the relative independence and we say orthogonality of this identity center-periphery cleavage, as it is called, allows us to properly analyze which is the impact of nationalism, because here nationalism does not necessarily mean right-wing. And because nationalism here does not necessarily mean being conservative in value. So we're going to see what nationalism does in a context where nationalism is actually a relatively independent axis. Thanks to the Centre d'Estudis d'Opinió, we can now try to shed some preliminary light on these questions, thanks to a survey that was conducted between 2010 and also 2011, where, among many other things, people were asked which was the perceived impact of immigration on the economy of Catalonia. And then here we see in the vertical axis, in the y-axis, a scale that goes from very, let's say, positive opinions about immigration, the low values, until very, very hostile negative opinions about immigration, which is the upper part of the scale. And in the horizontal axis, you see different parties. So if you look at, for instance, the second party that I'm plotting here, Convergència i Unió, the main center-right mainstream federation, which has a liberal component, as you know, and which also has a Christian democratic partner. In this case, the average of the electorate that voted for this federation in the last Catalan election in 2010 places itself relatively around 0.5, a little bit above 0.5, between 0.5 and 0.6 of this 0-1 scale, meaning that they are a little bit in the center towards, the center right as we would expect. This is a very, very similar position to the fourth party that I'm plotting, which is Partit dels Socialistes, the main left-wing party, which is, maybe not a 5.7, but it is a 5.6 or something, or 5.5. So basically, the difference between the nationalist, Catalanist center-right and the mainstream left-wing party in Catalonia is actually minimal in terms of positions on the immigration axis. If you see the third party, a classical independentist left-wing party called Esquerra Republicana de Catalunya, this electorate belongs to the lower quantile, to the lower part of the table. This electorate is actually relatively less anti-immigrant than all the other counterparts in the party system. And at the very end, we see the last nationalist party that I wanted to talk about, which is Solidaritat per la Independencia, new party, also explicitly independentist. And once again, this party is actually low, comparatively speaking, around the center of the table in this distribution of preferences. Who is above 0.6? Partido Popular, Spanish conservative right, Ciutadans, but very close to the 0.6, and of course, Plataforma per Catalunya, which is an explicitly radical, populist, radical right party that has had some success in the local elections and that almost makes it into the Catalan parliament in the last election. And now we'll see what happens. But according to one survey, they could take between 0 and 2 seats. And according to many other surveys, they would not take anything. But this is our reference category of populist radical right party. Not surprisingly, they score very high. They are almost at the top. They are just the most negative people. What happens if instead of economic hostility, we ask about cultural hostility? So in this case, which is the perception that we have about immigration on the cultural life of Catalonia? This was the question. We see exactly the same analysis and we see exactly the same distribution of preferences. We just see exactly the same. So basically, in this case, we see 3 main conclusions out of this very simple preliminary analysis. Plataforma per Catalunya's electorate is very hostile on both dimensions, but actually, especially in the economic one. So it is about economics, or is it about identity that people can vote for this party? Both, I would say, but if you really push me to pick one, I would say economy. Look at the previous graph. The cultural threat scores around 0.8, and the economic threat, it's close to 9. Of course, both of them are very high. I'm not going to claim that this is a very clear finding, but to be honest, I think it's giving us something about the role of cultural and identity threats in this country and its link with populist radical right party. Plataforma per Catalunya's vote is more about economic threat due to immigration than about cultural threat, even if both score very high. Second conclusion that we saw, Catalan nationalist electorates are not the most anti-immigration in relative terms. They kind of score in the middle, but in relative terms, they are actually in the bottom of the table. So they are actually, if you tell me, are they more anti-immigrant or pro-immigrant in relative terms, they are actually more pro-immigrant on average. And finally, for those of you familiar with the Catalan political space, that's just something very, very obvious, but the distribution of anti-immigrant attitudes across electorates, according to the last graphs, seem to follow a classical redistribution left-right logic. So very left-wing green socialist parties were the most pro-immigration. Iniciativa per Catalunya Verds is basically the most pro-immigrant electorate. Centrist parties are a bit more in the middle, and right-wing parties are just a bit more hostile. So this is not about identity, but about a classical left-right classic continuum, let's say. Let me just go a step forward in the analysis, and then I just run some statistical simulations and some work published of mine that I detail there. And then basically, in this case, I try to, I'm going to avoid methodological details, but here what we do is to predict radical right voting in Catalonia in the last election. And we do it and we predict radical right voting on the basis of left-right positions, identity nationalist positions, and economic threats vis-à-vis immigration. And then the entry is the probability to vote for radical right parties. The 10% that you see is the probability to vote radical because the immigration issue. So for instance, here the 34% means that we have two people. One of them is very pro-immigration. The other one is very anti-immigration. The anti-immigration person has a 34% more of probability to vote radical than the pro-immigration issue. This is a very massive, statistical result in this kind of analysis. But this only happens in the right-hand side of the spectrum. Center people are less responsive, and left people are just not responsive at all to the immigration issue. Anti-immigrant positions and radical right voting is actually not being observed at all among left-wing people. So you see that the left-right axis is driving the whole effect. Right people and parties positioned in the right-wing axis are actually those more likely to be affected by anti-immigrant positions. What happens if we replicate the same analysis, not with left-right now, but with identity issues? And you know that in Catalonia we categorize this feeling with only Spanish, Spanish as Catalan feeling, and Catalan feeling. We saw 34% of probability here, and we saw much lower probabilities to vote for radical right-wing party on the basis of identity feelings. So we see that among people who only feel Catalan, if we compare again a person against immigration and a person pro-immigration, very Catalanist people can increase a 9% of probability to vote for radical right voting. Yeah, there is an increase, but it's much lower than when we look at rightist people. It's actually even lower if we look at Spanish as Catalan, so neutral people, and only Spanish, where the probability to vote for radical right in the last election could rise up to 16%. So identity issues drive less the effect of immigration, but if you really again push me to pick which type of identity, is actually definitely not the Catalan one. There is a slightly higher responsiveness to vote radical in neutral and Spanish positions than in Catalan ones. Let me wrap up, zooming in towards local elections now. We're not going to talk about statistical simulations. We're going to talk about real electoral data, which is where the Plataforma per Catalunya, this radical right-wing party, has been successful in some municipalities in the last elections. I analyzed some vote transfers in my work with Professor Melins, and that has been also published already, and it's easily available. The transfers from 1999 to 2007, so the emergence of this party. And then we see that this party is successful only as we would expect, and as we saw also in previous presentations, in municipalities with a declining industrial sector and with very relevant stocks of immigrant population. And we see that in those municipalities where Plataforma is more successful, there are two main vote transfers from election to election. The Socialist Party and abstention. So people who voted before for the Socialist Party and people who abstained in the previous election are more likely to swing their vote for a radical right, which is okay and which is completely compatible with what we know about radical right-wing voting in other countries. Left-wing traditional spaces in relatively industrialized but declining municipalities are those more vulnerable to this kind of positions. We only detected a relevant transfer from Convergència i Unió, the center-right Catalanist mainstream party, towards radical right party in 2007 in a municipality called El Vendrell. That was a quite significant 23.7%, but that was still much below the transfer from the socialist space, 45.52%. Let me just finish with some conclusions. Nationalism, according to this data, and only so far, is not behind the emergence of populist radical right voting in Catalonia. Catalanist electorates are not particularly xenophobic. The distribution of anti-immigrant hostility actually follows a left-right logic in this very particular context. The statistical impact of hostility against migrants is clearly perceived among right-wing electorates and only in terms of economic impacts. And finally, let me just jump towards the very end. The impact of anti-immigrant attitudes is higher in neutral and Spanish identity positions rather than in Catalanist positions. Thank you very much.